of the environmental crisis, its connections to the social crisis. And what I'd like to do is to try to describe a little bit how one company also came to realize what the magnitude of the crisis, what we've done to act, how we have learned, and put it in that context. I think one of the things that Lisa started out with, the environmental crisis now has several faces. And the one that is the most urgent and the most well-known is climate change. But the second is habitat loss, which we've lost something like 50% of mammal species in the last 100 years. We've lost insect species. We're through the development of monocultures in agriculture, we've lost a lot there. The third, we have mega pollution of river streams and oceans. And then the fourth has been rising, particularly in the 20th century, the pandemics, zoonotic diseases that come up when you lose habitat, and we're getting diseases once confined to animals. So just to talk a little bit about how Patagonia got started. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the key moments that led us in the direction that we've taken. It makes a difference, I think, that we started out as a climbing equipment company. We did not start out as a clothing company. And the commercial interests of a climbing company are very different from an apparel company. You don't make good, better, best. You don't make a high couture line and a ready-to-wear line in mountain climbing equipment. The customer is trusting his or her life to the quality of your gear. And I remember early on when I was 21 or 22, sitting in the courtyard inspecting ice axes for hairline fractures and thinking that if I fall asleep on the job, someone's going to get hurt. And it's not going to be just anyone, it's going to be a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend of a friend, because that's how big the global climbing business was in the early 1970s. It also made a difference, I think, that we came out of climbing because the experience of the early employees, I was one of the few who was not a climber or a surfer. And if you are a climber, if you get just a kilometer away from the road, your experience of life changes very much from the day-to-day experience in a city. You really are you're vulnerable to the forces of nature. You feel an awe in an environment that is not built by human beings. So at once there's a kind of self-reliance and also a sense of vulnerability that comes in that really changes human experience. And if you've had this, it's very difficult to explain to somebody else who's never had it, but people who have had it feel a common bond, and they want to work to protect the places where they have felt this sense of engagement with the natural world. And surfers have it too. If you're just a little bit out from the shore and you're dealing with the power of wind and waves, people who sail have that as well. So, and climbers, when they would go back to places they had been before, would see the degradation of the environment in a way that those of us in the cities were much slower to see, because if you went back to Kilimanjaro after 5 years, you could see that the glaciers had receded. If you were fishing in the Sierra or the mountains in Wyoming, you would see that the fish were fewer and of smaller size over time. You would see the pollution of rivers when the algae blooms that would take out the oxygen and kill off the fish life. If you were a diver, you would see the coral reefs being bleached in Australia. All of the evidence of this degradation of the natural world was much more apparent to people who spent a lot of time outside than to those of us who spent time in the cities. What made a difference for us as a company, the first kind of really turning point was a moral dilemma that the company faced in 1972, because Chenard Equipment, this tiny little mountain climbing equipment company that I went to work for in 1973, by the early 1970s had become the world's leading supplier of climbing gear, had a reputation for making the best. It had a huge market share, still doing less than $1 million a year. But the product that had earned the company its reputation was the hard steel piton, was the spike that climbers use to for protection as they climb the rock. And what had happened is that these hard steel pitons, which had gained us our reputation because they could be used over and over again, the problem was that each time the piton was placed with a hammer and then tapped out with a hammer, so it was expanding the crack slightly. And what the owners of the company, Yvon Chenard and his then business partner, Tom Frost, realized was that the very way they were making their living was actually destroying their sport, and worse, it was desecrating the rock. And there was a consideration. They said, what can we do? Is there an alternative? And there was an alternative, because British climbers used a different means of protection. They didn't use a hammer to hammer in a spike. They used these aluminum wedges that could be attached to a wire, twisted in a crack, and hold under weight. And there were two problems with this as a method of climbing for Americans. The first was huge investment in tools and dies to make the range of sizes that you needed. It was really hard on the small business. Second was American climbers knew nothing about this method of climbing, and they trusted their lives to this satisfying feeling of hammering a piece of steel into the rock and that it's going to hold them under weight. So the decision they made was to go ahead and make the investment, but also to issue the first real serious catalog, 1972, that had a 12-page essay that was part manifesto on why climbers should switch to this new method of climbing. And secondly, it was also a user's manual which showed people how to use them. So to give you an idea of the impact this had, they went out in June 72. I came to work in March 73. When it went out, 70% of the business was pitons. When I came to work, 70% of the business was chocks, these aluminum wedges. So that catalog had been discussed at the base of every climb and every climbing club and in every climbing magazine, and transformed the way Americans climbed on rock. This was a lesson that I think is key, because, and it has to do with the small nature of the clientele. We did not talk to our customers as though we didn't use the language of manipulation that's very common in advertising. We didn't try to figure out who the customers were in order to give them a message that they would want to hear. We spoke to them as friends and peers, because the commercial world was small enough to do that. But it was a habit, I think, that we later adopted, that we would, if we discovered a problem with our business and wanted to make a change and wanted to talk to our customers to have them help us make that change, we spoke to them as peers and equals, and with the assumption that anything we had learned, they could learn also. And that has been critical in the development of the company. The second big lesson came in 1988, and we had been in the clothing business. We started Patagonia the first year I was at the company. It was, and the idea of getting into clothing was basically to pay for the climbing business, which made a profit of 1%. And it was unsustainable. The climbing business became the clothing business became very successful over the first decade that we were in business. I nearly sank it the first few years by ordering too many goods, and my colleagues in production nearly sank it by not knowing what colors to order and not knowing how to size products. But after a while, we got the hang of it. But in 1988, we opened a store in Boston. And after 3 days, we had to shut it down because employees were calling in sick with headaches and stomach aches. So we called in an environmental engineer, and he fixed the problem. But we asked him, what was the agent that made people ill? And he said, oh, that was formaldehyde off-gassing from the cotton clothes stored in your basement. And that was the first indication we had that cotton could be environmentally problematic. We knew the environmental damage of iron and steel. We knew the environmental damage of nylon and polyester that we made underwear and fleece from because it comes out of an oil well. But we had thought of cotton as this benign natural fiber. We commissioned an independent study of the 4 major fibers we used, and we learned that cotton was by far the worst. And not because of the formaldehyde, which is a finish used to stabilize the fabric, but because of the intense use of chemicals to cultivate cotton. And we asked ourselves the same question that we had asked ourselves earlier. Is there an alternative? And there was an alternative because organic cotton was still being grown. Turkey had not changed. They had a lot of organic cotton being grown. China did. Texas, a cooperative we still buy from, where one of the family members died early to cancer that they thought was caused by spraying, so they switched to organic. And it was still grown in California. And we made the decision that we were going to switch to organic cotton or get out of the sportswear business. And sportswear, shorts, pants, and shirts was about 1/3 of the business at the time. We did all our homework. We bought most of the organic cotton being grown in the San Joaquin Valley. But we didn't do quite enough homework, because what happened is that when we bought the cotton from the farmers, we broke our connection to the global supply chain, because those farmers had no relationship to the spinners who turn the fiber into yarn, no relationship to the mills that turn the yarn into fabric. And we had to find people to do the work on our own that we had never had to do before, because we would just place an order with an agent and they would, or place it with a factory, and they would do all the work for us. And we started to have an internal revolt at the company. It's Patagonia, so it was a fairly gentle revolt. But the people who have to design the clothes, and they said, we have to do everything we did last season. We have to design, we have to choose the colors, we have to spec the clothes, we have to take them to the major customers. And at the same time, all of a sudden, we have to find an entire new infrastructure for creating cotton sportswear, and have to raise our prices $3 to $5. And not a single customer has ever asked us for this. So how is this business? Why are we the martyrs? And what we ended up doing, because we did understand, we had come to understand more the toxicity of cultivating cotton, is we took our employees, about 40 at a time, in buses to the Central Valley. And the first thing to see firsthand what the conditions were, and the first thing you notice as the bus pulled into cotton country was the smell. You didn't even have to open the windows, because the organophosphates that are used to secure the plants are basically the same chemicals as nerve gases developed in World War II. And they have that smell. The second thing you notice is if you got out of the bus and you put your hand in the dirt, there was nothing alive. It takes worms 3 years to come back after you stop spraying. There's no vegetation. And at the end of the day, we would take people to an organic cotton farm. And the first thing you noticed there was it did not smell like an outdoor factory. You would notice that there were birds were nearby and that they would land on the ground, which they wouldn't on a conventional farm, and that there would be life in the soil. And as a result, when employees came back from these trips, everybody said, this is still a pain. This is really hard work, but the company is doing the right thing and we're going to help make this happen. And so what happened was that we had to cut our line by 2/3 for sportswear. We had to accept lower margins so that we didn't raise the prices entirely on the consumer. But after about 2 or 3 years, the business came back and the business changed because customers started to come to us for organic cotton clothing, not just for cotton clothing. We changed the story. And when we changed the story, we also changed the business. The next big development for us, I think, was we got very interested in William McDonough's idea of cradle-to-cradle manufacturing. And I think this has developed a little farther with Kate Rayworth's idea of donut economics. Has become more sophisticated. But we determined in 2005 that what we wanted to do was to take back any piece of clothing at the end of its life and to recycle it into something of equal or close to equal value. And we discovered quickly that it was beside the point to simply be circular, that there was a reason for the 4 R's, that reduce is really important because you should not be recycling something that shouldn't have been made in the first place. The second is nothing should be made that can't be repaired, which has become mostly the case, and it was the case for our clothing. If you broke a zipper, you'd have to get a new jacket. And the third thing was reuse, which is a big deal in clothing, where people get tired of what they're wearing, or they don't like red, or they lose pounds or gain pounds and can't wear that item. And it shouldn't just linger in a closet, because an enormous amount of environmental damage and social investment went into making that piece of clothing. So we looked at this and we decided we amped up our repair facilities. We changed the way we design clothes. We now run the largest clothing repair facility in North America. We provided a platform for customers to sell used clothing, and we're amping that up now. But the biggest problem for us to look at was reduce. How does a company that makes things tell customers to buy less? And what we decided to do, and on Black Friday 2011, we took out a full-page ad in the New York Times that's headline was "Don't buy this jacket." And the headline was meant to be arresting. But what we did in the body copy was to illustrate, we took one of the more environmentally benign products we make. It was an R2 jacket, 60% recycled polyester, as high as you could go on recycled content without losing performance. Lasts 10 to 15 years, and durability is extraordinarily important aspect of sustainability. And it could be recycled into something of equal value at the end of its life. Ship it to us, we ship it to Japan, they melt it down, they extrude new fiber, and they make a garment of equal value. But we also pointed out that the same jacket generated 23 times its weight in greenhouse gases, generated 2/3 its weight in waste, and that its manufacturer used enough water to meet the needs of a village for a day. And that as a manufacturer, we didn't know how to make anything that actually gave back to nature as much as we took, that we were basically extractive. and that everything we had been doing for the past 15 years to reduce our environmental harm was precisely that. It was a reduction of harm. It was not changing the game so that we were paying back as much as we were taking. So that was kind of the third major lesson. That ad got a lot of attention. And it also, I think, for the past several years, we have focused the business more and more, and will focus the business over the next 10 years, less on making new clothes than on a kind of universe of selling new clothes and used clothes and possibly getting into the rental business. The last story I want to tell before, and I kind of want to open it up for discussion, is a shift in our thinking in the last 10 years when we got into the food business. We got into the food business, and it's very small for us. It's called Patagonia Provisions, but it opened up a new world. And one of the new friends we made was a man named Wes Jackson, who's in his 80s now. And Wes Jackson has for 50 years, he's based in Salina, Kansas, and his life work has been to restore the Great Plains to health. And the Great Plains once had, it's the vast section of the United States in the middle of the country, formed by glaciers. The topsoil was once several meters thick, pounded by the hooves of buffalo. And now it's down to about 6 inches, the same depth as topsoil around the world, given to growing vast monocultural crops of soy, corn, and wheat, used mostly as animal feed and mostly for export. And Wes was talking about, he's an agronomist, and he had developed a perennial wheatgrass 20 years before called Kernza that has roots that go 3 meters deep into the ground. And those roots break up the microbes and fungi that create topsoil. And you could create topsoil faster than nature can. Nature is very slow to create topsoil. He was describing this to us, and we said, "Oh, that's wonderful, Wes. You know, this Kernza that you've developed, where can we buy some?" And he said, "Oh, you can't buy Kernza." We said, "Why not?" He says, "I can't get anyone to plant it." We said, "Why not?" And they said, "Well, the farmers won't plant what they can't sell." And so what we did is we contracted with a brewery in Portland, Oregon, to make an ale out of using Kernza as an ingredient. And we got the first 100 hectares of Kernza planted on an experimental farm in Minnesota. And now cereal companies are interested in purchasing Kernza, including it in their cereal, because they want to do a little carbon farming. Because one of the things that happens when you bring soil back to health is you don't need nearly as many inputs, even if they're organic. You need far less water, and you also have the potential to sequester carbon, to draw it deep out of the air, deep into the ground. So this taught us something. We with the provisions, we decided, you know, what we're going to do is we're not going to, any new product we make, we're not going to go with the kind of traditional marketing route. You know, you start a little organic food company and you make coffee and chocolate and things that people like. What we decided is every new product has to actually solve a problem in the food system or some problem in agriculture. That's the basis of the business. And I'd go back, you know, for 27 years, we had a mission statement. It was build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. And as we approached 2016, after Trump was elected, 2016 was kind of an amazing year, because you saw the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN, 183 countries signing on to that. You had the Paris Climate Accords. You had the Pope Francis's Laudato Si, an encyclical on environmentalism and the social problem. And at the same time, then you had the election of Donald Trump. You had Brexit. You started to see some of these reactions to the change in direction in the world. And we looked at this, and we also saw that the environmental crisis that we had been talking about for 27 years was getting much worse rather than better. That the acidification of the oceans, the pollution of the streams, the loss of species, the mega pollution, and then climate change, which had been episodic, now is becoming chronic. And we looked at our own mission statement, and then we also looked at the possibilities of Patagonia provisions and the idea of using business to actually solve a problem. And we changed the mission statement that year to, we're in business to save our home planet. Now, I was very skeptical. This was something Yvonne wanted to do. And I was skeptical. I hate mission statements. I think that they're usually nonsense. They usually use words that are only used when you don't intend to carry through on your promises. But I was skeptical of this as well because it was so aspirational. But I noticed right away our employees really taking it to heart and saying, okay, what does this mean? Save our home planet. What does this mean in my job? And it reminded me of the usefulness of shared language when the conditions are right and you can actually pursue that. I know that you're a business university and you're looking at companies that are much larger than ours. So Patagonia, we were over $1 billion. We were on our way to $1.5 billion when COVID struck. And we shut our business down completely for 8 or 9 weeks. We did not ship to e-commerce because we were concerned about the welfare of the workers in the warehouse. And we were also concerned because the apparel industry crashed at the beginning of COVID. Many companies lost sales of 50 to 60%. We have recovered, and we only had a 15% decline in our business. And we're doing okay. We didn't lose a lot of employees. But the reason I mention this is we're still fairly small for the kinds of companies that you're studying in business school. And Lisa talked last week, and Hilal was also talking about some of the challenges that larger, especially publicly traded companies face and whether they're serious when they're talking about environmental work or when they're talking about social changes. And so I just wanted to mention a couple of those things very briefly before we go into questions. And one is that in business, if you don't know this already, it's so much easier to make environmental improvements when you save money because it costs money to buy water, to buy energy, it costs money to have the trash hauled away, and it will cost money pretty soon for carbon. But social investments are much harder to make. And the social problem is intricately, the huge problem of inequality within and between countries is incredibly intertwined or inextricably intertwined with the environmental crisis. And I think one of the things, Kenzie Whalen at NYU Stern Business School published an article in Harvard Business Review on that businesses actually need, when they make social investments, they need to consider them as investments rather than increases in expenditure. And that there are now methodologies you can use to say, okay, if I invest here, what will the return for the business be in terms of increased employee engagement, reduced turnover, et cetera, et cetera. If I look back and when we made the switch to organic cotton, We just viewed that as the right thing to do, and we viewed it as a risk. We didn't view it as an investment, and I wonder if it would have been a calmer process if we had said, okay, we're going to do this. This is really difficult, but we're going to treat this as a major investment in the business, and these are the results that we want to have after time. But the other thing I wanted to mention with large businesses is you're not going to have, it's going to be a very difficult environment. You're going to have, so McDonald's, for instance, has done an awful lot of work to clean up its food practices in the supply chain and everything except beef. You know, they're really good about wheat and tomatoes and lettuce. But their practices in beef, they're like, I think, the third largest polluter in the world, and they haven't touched that because that's so critical to their business. The poster children for good behavior are Unilever and Danone. Danone is really still on track to become a B Corp, a benefit corporation for this 60 billion euro business. Unilever has made several of its subsidiaries B Corps. They're very serious about the work they do. I know people inside these companies. And yet at the same time, Unilever and Danone, along with Nestle, introduced single package food to Asian countries in the last 10 years, and produced this extraordinary pollution because there was no municipal waste system capable of handling the garbage, so it's all in the streams. And if you take graduate students to go down and analyze the garbage, you'll see a lot of Unilever and Danone packages. So white hats and black hats, good guys and bad guys. A lot of the people who, it's going to be very difficult. And a lot of the people who do some good also do some bad, Patagonia included. There are things that we don't know how to do to change our practices. And I think it's going to require a very different, it's going to require different analytical tools over the next decade to determine who's really on the road to helping to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals, who's really on the road to using business to help solve social and environmental problems rather than make them worse. Because the way we know how to do business is basically pretty harmful. So with that, that's not a good closing statement, but I think it's a realistic one. And again, I do think there's a role for business to play. If you want to say, okay, if we're going to do the right thing, if we're going to address climate change and especially address habitat loss, and if we're going to address the social problems we have, we need every form of social organization, which we don't have now. We don't have good governments everywhere. We don't have NGOs with permission to operate, because NGOs provide tremendous truth-telling capacity and also provide leverage against both governments and corporations. But business has a role to play. And even if you don't like capitalism, which a lot of us don't like the form capitalism takes now, business is going to be a force. We're going to make things and we're going to sell things as long as we're human beings. And so for business's role, I think, the good role that business can play is precisely to make products that we need and to make them in the right way. So now, Hilal, and open it back, send it back to you, and I'm happy to take questions and answer them.
Well, Richard, can you listen? Thank you. Thank you so much for the history of Patagonia. and actually history of Patagonia companies, how it developed since 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It's a kind of interesting history of the environmentalism in the United States. I wouldn't say in everywhere, because many of the places this came much later, but how Patagonia made business through environment, through what customers desire is changing. So giving this good kind of historical storytelling, I just want to say something very interesting, that there is a concept right now in only people that live in the US, they know about it. Maybe they can know other places, but they sort of make a profile of the liberal people. And when they make the profile of the liberal people, what they say, Starbucks latte sipping, Patagonia jacket wearing, and a Toyota or some electric cars driving. If you look at these three companies, they're totally different than each other. I wonder how you can make this sentence when you see in the newspapers. You generally see in the newspapers and places that maybe Fox TV, when they criticize liberal Americans, they use this. So I always was wondering, how do you feel on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cliche right now is that if you're a Biden supporter, you wore Patagonia, and a Trump supporter, you wore Carhartt. It's a little. We make expensive clothes relative to the price of other apparel, and this is actually kind of key to the industry, because clothing is now cheaper than it was, or it's more, rather, clothing was cheaper 50 years ago. Sorry, clothing is cheaper now than it was 50 years ago, by far. And that has come on the backs of the environment. It has come on the backs of workers who get squeezed out. So on the one hand, Patagonia gets a reputation for the affluence of a lot of our customer base. And then, so one of the things we are trying to address is how do you make clothing more available to more people? And that's part of the reason we like the idea of worn wear, rather than lowering our environmental or our labor standards.
Well,
but yeah.
No, I think I saw in the chat box also just say Patagucci. Have you ever heard this, Patagucci?
Oh yeah, we heard it it was first in the 70s. I first heard it in the 70s. So yeah, and it comes from the perception of the people who are wearing Patagonia are better off than most other people. And it also kind of relates. So I don't know quite how to connect this, but I think you have an economy in a lot of the world, and particularly in the United States, where about a third of the people are doing very well, and mostly the college educated. And about 2/3 of the people are not doing well, and that includes a lot of the Trump supporters who are rural and white, and it includes a lot of people who live in cities who are not white and who are a lot immigrant or just simply don't have a college degree. So one of the things that we look at is, if we're in business to save our home planet, is we need allies among the people who are poorer, are the ones who are the victims of environmental injustice first, because chemical plants don't put new chemical plants in Westchester or Santa Barbara, or they put them in Louisiana and Texas and places where people can't complain and be heard.
Yeah.
So we feel, as a kind of activist company, strongly that we have to establish stronger relationships with people who are not affluent, who are going to be allies in making a shift from the current economy to a new one.
So there's one question here that I read in the chat box. I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you. What do you think about GMO cotton? Do you use any?
No, we don't. The primary cotton has shifted now to GMO cotton and mostly to BT cotton, which has there's something called the Better Cotton Initiative, which has been sponsored by the cotton industry. And in a way, it's good that people have switched away from the worst practices. But it's also, in this case, good is the enemy of better, because not enough people have switched over to organic cotton, which is much superior. And organic cotton is still harmful. We're working on regenerative practices. How do you plant cotton with companion with turmeric in order to reduce its effect on the soil? How do you minimize the need for water, because cotton is a hugely thirsty plant?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think BT cotton just doesn't go much farther than conventional.
Okay, I will give the floor to Nora. Nora Marderosyan. She has a question to you, Vincent. Okay, it's
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for giving those examples and that story, that timeline. It's so interesting to hear, from a company that seems to be willing to question its business model. And I think that's the real challenge that most companies can't do or are unwilling to do, that they'd rather exist in a sort of willful ignorance, like the example you gave about McDonald's, in terms of let's make changes in the areas kind of on the margins that won't affect our core business model. And so the examples of really showing courage and openness to asking questions about the business model, doing a study of which is the most dangerous of the 4 fibers we use, and finding out that it's cotton. And instead of kind of shying away from that, actually asking the question, should we get out of sportswear entirely? I think it's such an interesting example. And, we think about in the food sector, what's the role of companies in shifting consumer behaviors?
Yeah.
It's a really tricky question when you think of, is that really the role of companies to be doing that? What are they willing to do? And my question to you is, especially since we're in a business school setting, what features of Patagonia's governance do you think lend itself to having that kind of culture of openness to questioning those really core features of its business?
Well, yes, I think your question goes to we are a B Corp, benefit corporation. And so we have written into our business charter and our articles of incorporation 6 or 7 key values that we adhere to. And that, I think, helps. And we also, more importantly, I think, submit every 3 years to an independent audit of our practices, how we affect each of our stakeholders. And I think that movement is really important for an answer to your question, is how do businesses govern themselves in order to reduce some of the harms they do, or in order to become a better social actor. I didn't use the example of Pepsi-Cola. I mean, we talked about Coca-Cola last week, but Pepsi-Cola under Indra Nooyi, she really tried. I mean, look at a business and you say, okay, my lead product is shipping sugar in water encased in plastic. And what's that? How's my model? What's my business growth in that product going to be 10 years from now? This is an antiquated product, but in terms of human health and in terms of its appeal to people, once you lose the taste for that level of sugar, you never get it back, etc. And she really tried to shift the company away from its reliance on soda, and had quite a hard time doing it. And she left, and people still at Pepsi are asking themselves, how is my business model going to work in 10 years? It's not going to work in 10 years. So companies are having their business models change on them, and they're going to need to adapt. It's interesting for me, people often come to me and they say, okay, how do you compromise between purpose and profit? How do you compromise between doing the right thing and doing well? And I say, if you ask that question, you're lost already. And I think that's what's happened with our company over the past 10 years is increasingly the business model is based on the practices. So in order to make a profit, we are making products that are innovative, and they're innovative based on the constraints we've placed on ourselves. So what we learn when we place constraints on ourselves leads to innovation and creates new products that are supporting the company, or new business models that are supporting the company, like Warnware. So that's in part, the implications of your question seem to relate to that. How do businesses make decisions on what their direction is going to be? And if you don't make those decisions, then those decisions, I think, are made for you by the market.
So, of course, this is also very relevant to energy companies. When we think about fossil fuels will be completely history in next 20 years, 30 years, and they are trying to shift right now, but most of them are struggling to really making clean energy, and they are trying to make how profitable they can do, but at the same time, also some of the clean energies are not really exactly too clean. So that's a big time discussion. What would be the best way to clean energy, or why we don't think about it to use a little bit less energy, which is less production, which is less growth. Then we come to this GDP story. Why countries are competing with the GDP, why companies are competing with how much their share will be higher. So as long as we go this direction, like you said, purpose versus profit, we will come again the kind of circular, but it's not the circular economy, but circular disaster. So there is one.
Well, just a quick comment, because we didn't talk. I mean, Patagonia is just a business. It's a traditional business that makes things and sells them, right? But most of the economy is not based around that. Most of the economy is based around finance. Lisa mentioned last week you have 500 or 600 people who have produced $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in new profits since the pandemic began. Well, those dollars are then the people who are managing those dollars are seeking the absolute maximum return for those dollars. And when there isn't enough good economic activity for those dollars to chase. That's one of the problems we have right now. And you cannot address the environmental crisis and the social crisis without addressing population and without addressing consumption levels. So, I started work in 1973. The world population is twice what it was. It went from 4 billion to 8 billion, and the economic activity is 10 to 15 times higher.
So combination of the two gives us a population, and the consumerism. It goes together hand in hand, and which one is the developed countries problem, the other one is the developing. Still, we can't really make this kind of how do we balance of this? So there's one question in this chat box from Şebnem Burnaz, and I am reading. How did you overcome intention action gap of consumers? We are all environmental friendly, but when it is time to purchase the product brand, our decision could be very different. Smiling.
Well, I think that for companies that make things, you also have to make the product very high quality and make it attractive. So, you know, a couple of examples, the Nissan did a heroic job promoting the Leaf.
Yes.
When it introduced it in 2011, and nobody bought it. But they promoted it as a green car, you know, for, you know, people who eat granola and wear Birkenstocks.
Yes.
And then Tesla came around and introduced a rocket ship that was, and the car writer said, this is the best car ever made. And so now the Leaf sells because Tesla made the electric car desirable. I was once at a conference with the founder of Seventh Generation, and someone from the audience. Seventh Generation is a environmentally sensitive, makes laundry soap and things like that, and very famous in the US. And somebody got up from the audience and said, I've been using your product since before they worked. Because environmentally sensitive laundry soap had the reputation for not getting your clothes clean.
Yes.
So that, I think, is part of the problem, is environmentally sensitive products are perceived as culturally limited, as expensive, and as not and not performing very highly. So I think if you address if you actually make things that work and you make them of high quality and they're also environmentally better, that I think the consumers will follow. But they won't pay more for just for most things, for things that are environmentally better, unless those other things are present.
So also the same thing again. I'm giving an example of the clean energy. I have a feeling that most of the solar technology shifting to solar, they are trying to finding the way that economic side it's cheaper, other than the environmentally right things to do. So the consumers, even though they are consider themselves environmentalists, like we are driving Prius, but we are also flying, you know, exponentially. So what we should. So that's a serious questions that we have to question. We ask to ourselves. Now the Oğuz Hoca is on the line. Here is the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Hilal Hocam. Vincent, I'm really interested in the formation of new universities. We've had a lot of opportunity here in Turkey last 20 years to design universities from ground up. And I have two questions, both similar questions. You know, Patagonia, after so many years, got into food, however limited the provisions. Has there been any intent or invitation to get into education? For instance, Patagonia University. So that's the first question. The second one, very much related. If we were to ask Patagonia's help to set up a brand new university from ground up in Turkey, who would you send to help us? And where should we start from? So kind of related questions.
I actually think, thank you. We've often talked not so much about creating a university. We conduct a weekend, a 3-day seminar every year, every 2 years for activists to help, because we give a lot of money. We give 1% of sales to grassroots environmental activists, and many of them have very small organizations. They're no bigger than a corner church. So we invite people who talk to them about marketing and campaigning and fundraising. And so we thought, what if we did a tools for entrepreneurs course on the topics that we talk about? And we've just never done it because of bandwidth. And I guess if you wanted to start a university based on some of the principles that Patagonia has talked about, I would invite you to ask Lisa Sachs, because I think that the limitations that we have as a company, what we have as an advantage is this practical experience, and the limitations we have is we don't have a larger context that a university needs. So that would be my. I'm sorry to enlist Lisa without consulting with her first, but I think that would be a better choice than anyone from Patagonia.
So here is the reasoning why Oğuz Hoca asked this question to you. In Turkey, every big time business establishment, they establish university. Sabancı University is owned by major corporations, and Koç University is also owned by major major corporations. These two are very competitive and very good, excellent universities. And there are many universities established by business people. I don't want to go, but for me, these two did a very great job. So that's why I think, but I don't know any example in the US, that kind of establishment, right? That's historically was more different. Historically was, I really don't know how can I answer American structure, but I know it's not the corporate business.
Yeah, I think there's some parallels in Korea and Japan, but I can't think of any in the States.
Yeah. There is a question again. I'm reading from Melek Akın Ateş. Customers increasingly demand sustainable supply chains and more transparency. What is Patagonia's take on that? One practice is sharing supplier lists, but is it only for the consumers? Does that also help suppliers to be more transparent? So supply chain would be much more responsible, kind of chain effect.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. Many companies do not know much about their own supply chain, because and part of it is willful ignorance. They don't want to know the practices of companies that they don't control that may lead to a problem. But increasingly, there's a demand for transparency by investors and also by consumers. In clothing, there's no, we publish our supplier list, and we publish information, deeper information than that on the Footprint Chronicles. But I've been hoping for the past 10 years for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to create a consumer-facing index for apparel and footwear. that would provide the consumer information on the environmental and social footprint of every product, and competitively, and done so in other words, if a customer goes in to look at a pair of jeans from Levi's or Wrangler or from Patagonia and put your cell phone up against a hang tag, you get a rating, and that rating is used by every company uses the same methodology. But I don't know if this will happen. I think one of the technologies actually that's going to help with this in the future is blockchain technology, because it provides a record for every component of a product, of what its origins are, and where the product was changed, or where value was added. So that may provide us the capacity in the future to know more about a particular product. The global supply chain it gives you all kinds of opportunities for bad behavior, because the effects in the old days in the United States, if you had a factory producing a product that was polluting, you felt that in your town. But now the United States is a consumer, is not a producing country, and so all of that pollution and a lot of the social problems are happening offshore.
Okay, I am reading one question from the chat box. Jean-Marc Chokran, I think. I'm sorry if I can't pronounce well. And you mentioned an audit that you go through every 3 years. Mm-hmm. Can you describe what it consists of, how it is carried out, and its impact on decisions made by the company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Briefly, the audit is conducted by B Lab, which sponsors benefit B corporations. And in order to become a B corporation, you submit yourself to this impact assessment. Mm-hmm. The average score for a company seeking B Corp status, the initial score is 55. And you have to have a score of 80 in order to become a B Corp. Okay. The evaluation is very complex. It's holistic. We're measured on everything from the ratio of CEO pay to that of the lowest paid employee, to whether we use permeable concrete in our parking lots. The score is divided into kind of 4 different stakeholders: how you treat your employees, suppliers, communities, and your effects on nature. And so our first score was 107, and 3 years later, it was helpful for us because we could look and see, okay, we're low here. We don't like what we're doing. We're not doing enough for communities that we're operating in. So we concentrated on that, and our score now is like 152 or 153, something like that. So we do a lot of the work internally, and then B Lab audits the work that we do.
How many companies are part of this group?
About 3,500, and in 65 different countries.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And about the same number of industries. And they've developed some. I'm on the committee for multinationals because there's more interest from publicly traded large companies in becoming B Corps.
But Patagonia is not publicly traded, right?
No, and most B Corps are privately held, but there's more interest in,
Okay.
Well, what is the high score? I mean, you mentioned 55 is the threshold, and 150. What is the range?
200 is the highest.
Okay, so you're pretty high with.
Yeah, and they're very good. I mean, they make this. They raise the bar, every couple of years. So it gets harder for us to get any better, because even though we improve our practices, they're demanding more, which is the way a standard should work.
Richard, would you like? Did you raise your hand? I'm trying to find, but I think
he might have dropped.
Okay.
So he will come back.
Yeah. Okay. And Pınar has a comment here. I like it. Patagonia's story is pretty much an example of action research, which is resting on the cycle of planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. It's a very good kind of summary of the history of Patagonia. So
thank you. Yeah, we're very much on the Aristotle. We very much believe in Aristotle's maxim: the unexamined life is not worth living. So the unexamined company is not worth running.
Very good. Ebru, why you don't talk yourself rather than I'm going to reading your question?
No, actually, it was a kind of like a comment on the track and trace. And I've been with the textile industry for over 30 years and have been involved in sustainable applications, possible sustainable applications, regenerative applications for the past 15 years. And currently I'm trying to bring in more of my permaculture passion and design introduction into the fashion industry at scale, very difficult task. And I'm trying to do this with my actually client base in Pakistan, which is even harder. But, you know, we just started an organic cotton initiative in one of the poorest areas in Pakistan, in Balochistan. And we're implementing blockchain into the cotton, you know, at the ginning stage, so that we can introduce this as more of a track and trace element, more not with the product itself, but how the community will regenerate and regenerate. So we're trying to build that story into actually the community building part, rather than having so many metric tons of organic cotton being introduced into the market. And we had Laudes Foundation come to us and say, we want all of your cotton. And we said no, because we want this to be a wider use and really like use the story and also the track and trace element as a source of inspiration, which is coming from a very, very difficult landscape, and show the people that this could be done, this is possible. So, you know, I think the industry, our industry needs more models, more versions of Patagonia, because I actually am running a course that I've called Climate Crisis in My Wardrobe, and it's in Turkish. I've introduced it to 800 people over the past 5 months, mostly university students. And Patagonia has been one of my inspirations. I use your videos and give examples. And I think the more we talk about the possibilities and show people what is possible, because as in permaculture mindset, every problem also possesses the solution. So if we can introduce this kind of interbeing and show people that we're connected through ecosystems, living ecosystems, and it's in our clothes, it's in whatever we eat, then we have a wider possibility of having people interested, you know, become interested, and that changes their behavior. So that gives me actually hope and passion.
Yeah, I think you're doing really interesting work, and I think when we talk about business, and especially when we're talking in an academic setting about how business can be better, it's really important to remember that the ill effects of business are felt in specific places, in specific communities, and that what we really need to look at is the health of the community, not the health of the business in some way. You know, health of individual business is fine, but the business as a sector, not so important as communities, and because that's where the ill effects are felt.
Yes.
And the good effects can be felt as well.
Exactly. And I convinced actually an entrepreneur here in Turkey to start a biodynamic cotton production just in a small land, 300 acres in Iğdır, in a very remote region in Turkey. And that is going to be about, you know, bringing more of this, again, living systems capital and cultural capital to marry it into the financial capital. So if we can really like bring all these examples, whether, you know, they're big or small, the size doesn't really matter. The story tells itself. Then we can give people the hope and the aspiration, the inspiration, and then they can say, okay, this is possible. I can then change my business or I can then change my behavior.
Yeah, you're on the cutting edge. You're doing wonderful work.
Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, very impressive. Also, you have some comments why you don't say yourself rather than I read here.
Well, I think we can continue ad infinitum, but being that this is a class, I would very much like our PhD students to engage and to say what's on their mind. And you know, whether it's a comment or a question, I think it would be highly desirable to hear them hear themselves, and we can also continue afterwards.
Okay, students, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hocam.
Tuba. Okay, Ranjima.
Thank you very much for the lovely speech, Vincent. And I have an utmost respect to Patagonia, actually. And I think that it's quite courageous to put this transparency on your reports as well. I mean, being audited by B Corp and publishing all B Corp reports on your website is quite a courageous thing, if you're asking me. And there is a question coming from that, actually. I mean, I know lots of companies actually audited by different companies about their sustainability, performance, and other stuff, but they actually are quite hesitant to put it on their website because of the criticism they might get from this report. Because when you are audited yourself, you actually the main idea behind the audit process is finding the weak parts, and just make them better in somehow. So when I checked your B Corp reports, I realized, for example, the Patagonia's B Corp score is the same for the last 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. So of course, you are doing lots of things, and keeping this sustainability performance in this high level is quite hard, by the way. You are doing fantastic work, if you're asking me. But people may criticize you about this. Why are you losing your leads profile in the sustainable company or other stuff? So are you, don't you afraid of criticism getting from your customers and other stuff by being that transparent?
Well, just a couple of questions there. The first is that one of the challenges we have is we've been growing as a business. And so our environmental impact per unit goes down, but our environmental impact overall goes up, or tends to go up. So we're trying to reduce our environmental impact at the same time that we've been growing until last year. Second is the B Corp standards have been the bar has been raised. So I think we were like 1/10 of 1 point down from 3 years earlier. And what we recognize over time for the next 10 years, one of the things that becomes really critical for us is how do we reduce the impact? 86% of our environmental impact is in our fabrics. So how do we get out of the use of virgin fossil fuels? and then how do we do more work on growing cotton regeneratively. So that's where we are with the B Corp score. I think we try to, as much as possible, be very transparent about where we face long-term challenges environmentally, because we want the customers, or we want the world to hear it from Patagonia first. We don't want to be taken down by an NGO, which we have a couple of times. So I think it's important in transparency for companies to share their successes so other companies can learn from them. And I think it's also important to share the challenges. What is it you haven't learned how to do?
Okay, Cihan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal Hocam. First of all, thank you for sharing this wonderful story with us, Vincent. Especially after being a PhD student in action research, this question comes to my mind more frequently. I wonder if there is a room for widening, expanding the boundaries of your story by collaborating with some other actors, such as individuals, organizations, governments, etc. Do you think is there?
Yeah, no, I think we have a very kind of deep network of environmental organizations that we've engaged with over time. And we've engaged in a lot of environmental campaigns. So that's on the kind of that part of the company, which I didn't talk a lot about in our talk, but we have given 1% of sales to these environmental organizations since 1985. Then we are engaged, we're not engaged a lot with the universities, but we are engaged in a lot of experimental programs now in India on regenerative cotton. We engage with suppliers on trying to find new materials that are more resource efficient and less harmful. So there's a lot of, we're not operating in a vacuum. We are, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, or maybe there's but we're engaged with a lot of different organizations. There hasn't been a lot of opportunity for cooperation with the government during the past 4 years. As a matter of fact, we sued the government over their environmental practices, but I think with the change in administration, that may change as well.
Well, this court case is going on right now?
Yeah, it's still going on. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to have such an opportunity to raise your voice even to the more powerful players.
Well, we joined with the Indian tribes. So the people primarily involved in the suit are the tribes.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And you have any info? We keep asking a lot of questions, but it's interesting. Do you have anything that comment or knowledge about what's going on Indian farmers? Because they have been really uprising and worldly, and it's a big time issue.
Yeah, the farmers that we have been engaged with have they're involved with a couple of they're vertical companies that own the farms and then also own the mills and then own the sewing factories. This is only in India. There's no place else in the world that I know of that where you have that kind of verticality. So that's where we're working with the farmers. But I know that the situation is really dire.
Especially right now because of COVID, of course, that's become much more problematic, unfortunately. I think we make you really tired early morning. Thank you. It was
Well,
lovely.
thank you.
Lovely to
Thanks.
chat, all of you. Wonderful.
Yeah.
We keep going it. We keep doing more and more, hopefully. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Also,
Thank you so much for your engagement and for, yeah, it's really a pleasure to be with you. So.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for accepting this. It's a very big privilege for us, for our students. Thank you.
Okay.
Also,
And we are going to ask your help nevertheless.
For the university.
For many things, because just to join Cihan's call, Walmart, the Walton family, evidently wanted to look into their supply chain, and they called all their suppliers to New York for a conference, and nobody showed up, especially those that are environmentally aware and practicing sustainable business models. So they called Yvonne, your co-author, the founder, and said, would you co-sign this invitation with us? And when that was done, a lot of people came to the conference.
Everyone came.
So we would love to do something like that with our mission here, with our plight.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us, Vincent. It's been wonderful, very educational. Thank you. And thank you, everybody.
It was wonderful questions and comments. Thank you all. I think Vincent raised a lot of action to the program. Thank you. And now, students, you are not going anywhere.
Okay.
I'm
going to bid you goodbye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And everyone, thanks for coming.
We give 15 minutes, right?
And rejoin at Pınar's Zoom.
Pınar Zoom.
All welcome to my Zoom.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Çok teşekkürler Hilal Hocam. Harikaydı.
Çok iyi oldu. Evet, çok güzeldi.
Nasıl güzel bir şeyleri var yalnız gerçekten ya. Hikayeleri var. Bayıldım.
Evet, değil mi?
Bayıldım yani gerçekten de hani. Bu seviyede sustainability
çok sindirilmiş değil mi ya Tuğba? Çok sindirilmiş bir haliydi.
Oradan olmuş değil yani. Mış gibi değil yani. Hani o körün şeyinden geliyor. Korundan gelen bir değer olarak gelmiş yani. O yüzden hani sonradan böyle yerleştirilmeye çalışmıyor şimdi şu anda organizasyona. Zaten öyle doğmuşlar.
Çok ilginç bir ailedir. Biliyorsunuz şunlar Vincent'in amcası ve Şunar'ın karısı Melinda son derece ilginç bir kadındır. Yani çok böyle hiçbir yere business class uçuşla gitmezler. Hiçbir yere asla. Bir küçük Prius'ları kullanırlar. Onların en büyük lüksü işte o Patagonya'da büyük araziler alıyorlar ki o araziler şeye açılmasın.
Ona devlete hibe etmişler Arjantin'e.
Evet.
Yani milyon
daha fazla ipinin olması gerekiyor. Özel sektöre girmesi gerekiyor. Bence işin özü bu.
Şimdi iki çocukları var. Onlara galiba bir tane şirketlerinde bir pay verdiler. Bir de oturdukları evi verdiler. Başka hiçbir inheritance'ları yok.
Evet, vakıftaymış her şey.
Evet, hepsi.
Şirket de trust'taymış.
Evet, hepsi öyle.
Bir de Hilal Hocam bu B Corp mevzuatına bir bakmak lazım. Benefit Corporation.
Tamam.
Bunu belki Türkiye'de de yapabiliriz. Yani
tabii.
Vakıf dışında ayrı bir statü.
Vallahi
sertifikası olan şirketler var Türkiye'de de.
Ne sertifikası?
B Corp sertifikası olan şirketler var Türkiye'de de.
Ama bu sırf bir sertifika mı yoksa?
Hayır, audit yaparak veriyorlar zaten. Hani B Corp şirketi olabilmek için belli bir şeyin üzerine çıkmanız gerekiyor. O şeyin auditten geçiyorsunuz, belli bir puan tutmanız gerekiyor. O zaman hani sertifikalı B Corp
sadece
şirketi.
bir audit mi bu iş?
Yok.
Yani B Corp diye bir statü yok mu? Hani limited, AŞ falan.
Yok.
Hayır, bu bir şey. Sadece
Platform.
audit, sertifika.
That's disappointing. O zaman biz Türkiye'de bunu bir şey yapabiliriz.
Yapalım.
Yeni bir incorporation ya yeni bir statü haline getirmeye çalışabiliriz. Yani tüzel kişi.
Olacak.
Hilal Hocam, bunu bir Richard'la düşünseniz de dünyada ilk şeyi legislated B Corp'u biz yapsak burada.
Ya ne oldu? Üniversite kuruyordunuz?
Onu yapıyoruz her halükarda. O zaten yani haftaya
kurulacak mı?
imzalıyoruz haftaya sözleşmeyi.
İnanmıyorum.
Evet.
Nerede kuruyorsunuz?
Anlatırım sonra. Çok hikaye var.
Bir tane
Ne
daha
oluyor
var.
ya? Neyi kaçırdık biz acaba?
Evet yani. İlginç. Vallahi bravo size.
Evet. Hikaye bol.
Tamam yapalım, düşünelim. Bu Benefit Corporation'a bakalım. Olmazsa başka bir şey düşünebiliriz. Yani eğer o sadece bir platformsa onu bir corporation şekline getirebilir miyiz, getiremez miyiz? O biraz zor.
Yani, bu şimdi yani bu iş özendirme, kontrol etme, havuç, sopa işten farklı bir iş olursa
Evet.
ve bu ülke teşvikler ülkesi. Yani dünyadaki en az corporate tax'i falan veren bir ülke burası.
Vay canına.
Yani şeyi bilinmiyor ama inanılmaz düşük kurumsal vergi veriliyor bu ülkede.
Sadece devlet memurları %30 maaşlarını.
Vergilerimiz niye o kadar yüksek o
ve
zaman?
şirketlere direkt burası direkt vergi ülkesi ya, harcadıkça ödüyorsun. Asıl yani bambaşka bir ülke o açıdan vergi sorunu. Yani o kadar çok teşvik var ki başka bir sistem, teşvik sistemi yaratırsak zannediyorum yani bunu anlatabiliriz şeye. Kamuya da yani şu anki hükümete de anlatabiliriz. Ama rekabete de kolaylıkla anlatabiliriz. Gerçekten bunu da böyle bir şeyi arama kürsüsünden de bir policy paper olarak da yayınlayabiliriz. Çok güzel olur.
Tamam, düşünüyoruz bunu.
Sizinle
Evet. Ama Türkiye'deki sorun rule of law. Yani Türkiye'de rule of law yok.
Tabii.
Buyurun.
Onu da ayrıca konuşalım.
Investor'ı nasıl getireceksin? Hani tamam vergi düşük ama adam güvenemiyor ki, bir gecede kararname çıkıyor. Sabah bir uyanıyorsun, hayatın alt üst olmuş falan yani.
Ama doğru, dediğin doğru. Yani bir consistency yok. Onun için zaten yabancı sermayede sorun var anladığım kadarıyla, değil mi?
Ya başka bir yere doğru kayıyoruz. Büyük makro problemlere girersek hiçbir şey yapamayız.
Doğrusu da doğru söylüyorsun.
Ama yani kesinlikle Pınar'ın söylediği, içinde bulunduğumuz ortamın bir realitesi, bir constraint'i. Tabii ki onu da kale almamız lazım ama bir yandan da bu harekette iyi örnekleri özendirmek lazım. İyi örnekler de Türkiye'de aynen şeyler gibi, tüketiciler gibi hediye verirsen alıyorlar malını. İskonto yapınca, indirim yapınca alıyorlar. Yani acayip duyarlılık var. Yani elasticity fantastik yani. Azıcık teşvik ver, hemen oynamaya başlıyor herkes.
Yapmayın ya. Doğru mudur bu?
Olmaz mı? Olmaz mı?
Hiç ben düşünmedim. Şu teşvik listesine bir bakalım. Belki bir
Kampanya cenneti burası. İlk önce fiyatlar artırılır, sonra indirilir, kampanya denir falan. Yani bir sürü mışgibilik de var da yani mentalite olarak kendi kültürümüzde çalışabilecek, yani davranışı bu yöne doğru döndürebilecek leverage'lerden bir tanesi. It may not work ama yani it's something we can package and offer as a thought piece.
Yes, we should look at this. When Vincent was telling me a year ago, I didn't pay attention too much this B Corp, but if
Very
you
exciting.
know, good. I didn't really pay attention. Yeah, he explained quite a long time, but good Tuba, you know that.
Yeah, I know it.
She
I
is
know a company, by the way.
nose deep into sustainability practices.
Good, very
She's
good.
our resident expert.
Perfect. Okay, so it's 20:45. What about 21? 15 minutes.
Perfect.
Is it good?
Hocam
Yes.
ben izninizi rica ediyorum.
Of
Bir daha
course, hocam.
pazartesiye
Siz
görüşmek üzere.
gidebilirsiniz. Ama
Sağ olun.
üniversite işini bilmek istiyorum.
Anlatacağım.
Güzel.
Biz de bilmek istiyoruz hocam.
Olur.
Güzel.
Mümkünse en son benim haberim oluyor.
Senin haberin olmasın.
Senin her şeyden haberin var. Onun için olmadan bir şey yapmamak lazım.
Tabii. Çok doğru.
Daha olmuş bir şey yok yani.
Aynen. Zaten olmuş bir şey olsa bile bizim memlekette olana kadar yıllar geçer.
O da doğru.
Ya daha hızlı da olabiliyoruz bazen.
Aynen.
Yoluna bakmak güzel.
Aynen. Görüşmek üzere. Çok teşekkürler Hilal hocam. Görüşürüz arkadaşlar.
Teşekkür ederiz.
Yarın görüşüyoruz öğrenciler.
Yarın ne var?
Yarın diğer transformation dersi var.
Okay.
TEMSA'dan haberler var.
Güzel.
Görüşürüz.
Okay. Yarın benim daha ciddi bir sürü bir işim vardı. Okay.
Hoşça kalın.
Görüşürüz.